One of the things that is so devastating about being in an abusive situation is its unpredictability. For those of you who have been in that kind of situation, and it doesn't start out like that, right? They often refer to it as a lobster in a pot because when you first get in, the water's fine, and slowly over time, it starts getting hotter until you don't realize until it's too late that you're in boiling water. And when I was in prison, the same thing happened, the same unpredictability. And a couple of you wanted to know more about the rules. And so I wanted to touch base on that and also really compare the two because there's a value in that. In prison, I got in trouble for seemingly everything. Within a few days of getting to prison, I got an $85 fine because I took the sleeves off of my nightgown. There were a bunch of other women who had taken the sleeves off of their nightgown. It was basically like a big t-shirt, but the t-shirt went like past my knees and past my elbows. And so the sleeve like reached down, the edge of the sleeve was like down by my rib cage, and the sleeve was just this huge piece of fabric. And so I took the seam and unstitched it so that it would not have sleeves. And at the time, I was in isolation. So for most of the day, I was in my cell. So I got in trouble for destroying state property. So I guess even though they gave it to me, it wasn't really mine. It was still the state's. I got in trouble for speaking. I got in trouble for not speaking. I got in trouble for moving, for blinking, for not moving, for not blinking, for talking too loud, for talking too quiet, for having too many pens, for having too many tampons, for having too much toilet paper, for having too many letters, for having too many photos, for having too much food. I cut out some paper snowflakes and hung them in my window. I got in trouble for that. I was being escorted down a hallway once, and I was shackled and handcuffed, and the guard that was escorting me was talking to another guard, and he and the other guard were chatting, and one of them said, "Oh, well, no one knows why the sky is blue." Well, I have some science degrees, and I know why the sky is blue. So I started talking, and I started talking about light waves and, different wavelengths and how they reflect and refract differently. And that was the wrong time to share that information. I was in solitary for that. I got in trouble for standing up for other inmates. I got in trouble for saying no. There was one instance in the prison laundry where the woman overseeing it, she was awful. She came in with fast food and she wanted me to eat the fries in front of the other inmates. Like I was the only one who was being given the fries. And it just so happened that the other woman I was with was a Black woman. And the guard started making these racist comments and was telling me to eat these fries. And was telling me that I needed to make sounds to show how tasty they were, like, mmm. And I refused. That was a violent punishment. I had my visits taken away. I had my phone calls taken away. I was put in solitary, and I got plenty of physical punishments. Now, what made this tricky is that I didn't know what the rules were. When a person goes to prison, there is no manual or handbook that is handed to you of like, here's the rules. The rules change, and every corrections officer has within their job description the discretion to do whatever they feel is necessary to enforce security and safety, which can be interpreted in a lot of ways. So each set of corrections teams would have different rules. And all of the inmates knew what COs were lax, which ones weren't. We all knew when we could swap commissary and when we couldn't based on who was working. And so it was subjective, and it was situational, and it was conditional, much like an abusive relationship. Because I did have good days in prison. There were some days where I woke up and I went to my job and there was no drama and I just worked and it was good. And then I went to the gym and I did my exercises and I had my phone calls and I wrote my letters and I read my books, and all in all, it was a pretty decent day. like all things considered, that I was in prison. It was a good day, and I did find joy. There were days when I found joy. And then there would be days like the one when my daughter was going to come and visit. My mom had flown across the country to go and pick her up and bring her back to Utah. And I was in the kitchen that morning when all of a sudden we got shut down. Everything was put on lockdown because there was a fight that broke out on the men's side. And it was catastrophic. A few people had to be life flighted to the hospital because of it. So the entire prison was shut down, complete lockdown. And my visit was canceled. Now, it didn't matter that my mom had flown 2,500 miles to go pick up my daughter and that my daughter and mom had flown 2,500 miles to come just visit me. None of that mattered. So on that day, the predictability of the visit was gone. Too bad. But then a few days later, after my mom had taken my daughter back and was no longer in Utah, we got off lockdown and my next visit was allowed just fine. The psychological torture of being in an unpredictable situation is what makes prison so difficult. Because I never knew if the corrections officer was dangerous or not. Half of them were willing to spit in my face, so that meant the other half might be willing to. The other half were willing to use their baton on me. Did that mean the others were too? Half were willing to spit in my food or put cigarettes out in it and then tell me to eat it. Does that mean the other half are too? And just like when I was in the abusive situation in my former life, sometimes there were good days, but I could never predict or control when the bad days would happen. And with that being said, if I had to choose between the abusive former life or being in prison again, I would choose prison. And I share this because for those of you who are still in actively abusive situations, or if you are healing and out of it and you're in a safe place now, but you still have all these traumas and triggers and PTSD and all of this difficult stuff where it makes it difficult to feel like you can ever get away from it, that unpredictability is part of what makes it so difficult. And there's a lot of power in reminding yourself that you're still safe, that you are safe, that you are loved, that you are worthy. And I just want to give some space to how damaging that kind of interaction is, because countless of you, so many of you have reached out and shared that you're either actively in those situations or you're out of them, but still stuck in them. And I want you to know it's hard, and that's okay. But you recognizing that it's hard is the inspiration to change it. And that's you loving yourself. And so I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with you. There are horrible things that happened to you that weren't fair to you. And just because those people are doing something awful to you does not mean that you're awful. It just means that you need to love yourself a little more so you can get out. And if you're already out, it means that you need to love yourself a little more to let go.